Well, as they get dismissed this morning, we're going to continue and finish a sermon conversation called Whiff, where we're taking a look at some of the strong smells from the Gospels. And the first couple weeks were good smells, like a charcoal fire and perfume. And then we took a turn last week, and we talked about the smell of decay. And then today we're going to talk about the smell of sacrifices. So we're going to end at an altar with a guy named Zechariah. But before we do, let me give another plug for the next sermon series that we're going to have here at Advent starting next week. It's called Conversations with the Creator, where we're going to take 7 straight weeks and talk about 7 different things that we do in a worship service, just to do a deeper dive on what those things are and why we do those things. And then we're going to do this master's class on Sunday evenings through the month of July. So from 6 to 7 p.m., whatever we talk about that morning, we're going to put into practice that night. So for instance, on July the 8th, we're going to talk about why we give sermons. And I'm going to pick 3 people from our community to give it a try. So we're going to have like a preach-off on Sunday evening on July the 8th. You will not want to miss that. Because you think people have a fear of public speaking. Why don't you salt onto that? Speaking on behalf of God in a sermon. It's going to be amazing. So I'm going to give them a crash course how to put a sermon together. Then we're going to turn them loose, and we're going to see what's going to happen from there. So it's going to be a great time. So we encourage you to dial in for the next 7 weeks through the rest of our summer weeks together. Well, let me start off with this conversation with, for sports fans, this is going to be something that you heard this week, but Dwight Clark, the famous tight end for the San Francisco 49ers, unfortunately passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 61. Most famously known for the catch. This happened in the 1982 NFC Championship game between the 49ers and the deplorable Dallas Cowboys. Can I hear an amen? And if you remember this play, I was only 1 year old at the time, so I don't remember this play, but maybe some of you do. But Joe Montana had to flee the pocket because of some pressure from Ed Too Tall Jones, and he threw this lollipop of a pass into the end zone, and everyone thought that it was going to be overthrown. If you could turn your attention to the guy in the lower left, the camera guy, he's got a look of bewilderment on his face. He feels like it's going to go over Clark's head, and then Clark seems to have these go-go gadget arms, and he collects the pass, which ultimately gave them the lead and the win for the championship. And they went to the Super Bowl and beat the Bengals that year. One 49ers fan still around, okay? Or anti-Bengals fans, is that a thing? Okay, and so this started off this dynasty, this run from the San Francisco 49ers. What if I were to tell you, though, that Dwight Clark in college played 3 full seasons of football, but only caught 33 total passes in his college football career? And it might be because at that time, the offense that they ran in college football was a run-based offense where the tight ends, because tight ends are quarterbacks without an arm. Can I hear an amen? And they were big and they could block. And so basically they had the task of blocking a lot and maybe running some routes just to throw the defense off. But they rarely got the ball thrown to them until the West Coast, Best Coast offense was implemented by Bill Walsh. And all of a sudden the tight end became one of the most important chess pieces in the offense's arsenal. And so you can imagine being Clark, 33 passes, all that time in the weight room, all that time in the practice field, all that time in the film room. You get towards the end of your college career, you've got a college degree, and they're whispering to you that you should try to get into the draft. But you think to yourself, it took me 25 minutes to get out of bed this morning because I was cracking everywhere. You can imagine he was asking the question, why am I still wanting to do this, right? This moment of internal dialogue. Well, he decides to continue on. Instead of going sell insurance somewhere, nothing, there's anything wrong with that, but instead of selling insurance, he decides to become a pro football player. He caught 506 passes in his 9-year NFL career because he, as a tight end, was noticed in a new offensive scheme. Imagine what would have happened if he would have caved in to the conversation inside. Why do I still want to do this? What is this adding up to? But since he didn't cave in, the catch and other moments are cemented in NFL history because of it. You know, I think you and I are like Dwight Clark. I think there's something going on in our life where we're asking the same question or a question like it. Why do I continue to do this? This doesn't seem to be working. Maybe I should pack this thing up and move on to something else. Maybe you've been donating a lot of extra time at the office and it doesn't seem like it's being noticed or appreciated and it's time away from your family. And you begin to think to yourself, why does this all matter? There's some of us who have adult kids, and I've noticed this, particularly here at Advent Pres. We have adult kids, and we raise them up in church, and they got on their own, and they're kind of out there trying to find themselves. And part of that finding themselves is they're not attending church anywhere. And you begin to think to yourself, what was all that activity? What were all those family devotions? What were all those prayers together? What was all those trips that I sent them in youth group? Is it all going to matter in the end? Or maybe you've got a spouse and like you're totally into following Jesus, but they are still kind of putting their toe in the water, trying to maybe ask their questions and seeking their answers, and you pray for them and you have extreme patience and there's a lot of encouragement, but it's going on for years and years and years and there seems to be no evidence that anything's happening, and you're asking yourself, what is this all going to add up to? Hopefully today, as we meet a biblical character who's probably asking that same question, you and I can find some answers. We go to Luke chapter 1, and we meet this character, Zechariah, whose wife Elizabeth and him are going to be the parents of John the Baptist. And it's a huge role, but in verse 8, we find that Zechariah is a priest, but being a priest is kind of like his side hustle. You'll notice that they kind of have this schedule, like there's a big Google Doc out there, like your family takes care of sacrifices this month and these weeks, and then we'll switch it over to Zedediah's house and to Bar Jesus' house and all this stuff. And so he's this there, part-time basis, substitute priest, but he's doing some sacrifices at the Temple Mount in Luke chapter 1. But he and his wife have an ache in their heart. She's a bit past the childbearing ages, and they don't have a child. And they've been praying, and Luke tells us specifically that they are blameless and upright people, that if anyone deserves a child, it's these two. But they're struggling. And so you can imagine the collision that's going on in his soul. He's doing this mundane work of gathering the animals and cutting them apart and putting them in the right places and making sure there's enough wood on the fire to burn the sacrifices. But deep inside, as he's standing in the shadow of that big building where God's presence supposedly resides, he's asking, when is it going to be our turn for our prayer to be answered, right? So as he's like maybe getting a stack of wood and putting an animal on the altar for sacrifice, an angel shows up and begins to give him a message. We picked the story up in verse 12 of Luke chapter 1. It says, when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and he was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink. This is where the Baptists get their practice. Okay, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he was born. Okay, so here's the thing. This guy, like, put yourself in Zechariah's shoes. You're going from doing mundane tasks, your side hustle, you got this ache in your heart, and you get a message. Not only are you going to be a parent, but you need to prepare yourself because your child has great destiny, and you need to be prepared for the outworking of their life. Didn't have really a ton of time to calculate what that's going to mean and to be. There's actually a little bit of flair of humor in this story because Zechariah, he doesn't believe this at first, and so the angel says, fine, you're not going to talk for a while, and Elizabeth, his wife, is, yes! Right? But I think this highlights something around the altar sacrifice here. I think callings and the chance to lead is a collision of two things at once. It happens often in the midst of the mundane when we have an ache in our heart. When those two things are happening in a weather forecast in our soul, God tends to speak very clearly. And I think this highlights something about leadership. People think that leaders are born, and that's true. Some people, they come out of the womb and they're just ready to go, and they walk around like they own the place, and they've got swagger, okay? Like, there's just some people like that. And some people think that leaders are taught, which is kind of true as well. You can go get a leadership degree. You can be put into tracks in some organizations out there, and you can learn to lead. But there's something that's also true. Leaders, more often than not, are summoned. an event happens and you must drop everything because it's your turn to lead and to do something about it. This reminds me of a story of a young man named Titus. At 7 years old, he and his two sisters were in their mom's pickup truck. They were riding home on a snowy evening after a Thanksgiving gathering at a family's place. And their mom unbuckled the seatbelt because she couldn't reach the cell phone in the back of the truck. And as she turned to try to reach for the cell phone, she lost control of the truck. It careened into a nearby field and it eventually wrecked in the ditch. And she was catapulted 10 feet out of the pickup truck. So Titus, who is 7, and his two younger sisters are inside the truck, and he has to wake up and do something. He checks on his mom. He's got his pajamas and no shoes on because they're going to go right to bed when they got home, and he had a decision to make in that moment. He decided to run a half a mile down the road on a 23-degree evening through a snow-packed street to the nearest farmhouse to find help for his mom. Experts say, the medical experts who worked on his mom later said that if he would have waited by the truck to wave down the next car, she would not have made it. Lynn Sweet says this: leadership summons us, where we get clarity, and we've got to do something about it. Notice that Titus is not asking the question that perhaps Dwight Clark is at the end of his college football career. He's not asking the questions that Zechariah is around the altar. He's not asking the questions that you and I have. He's got crystal clear clarity. I've got to go to point A to point B in order to get this thing done. And that's what happens with us. I'm willing to bet that for all of us in this room, there has been something recently in life that has awakened us, that has summoned us. A cause or a problem or an opportunity has so apprehended us. It's the thing where when you begin to talk about it with your family, your heart begins to race, and you begin to talk really fast, and they say, hey, slow down. You're faster than Pastor Joe on Sunday mornings. You need to slow down a little bit, okay? Something has summoned us, and I just want to say that that's evidence that we are around the altar and that God is speaking to us like he spoke to Zechariah on this faithful day. But let's talk about sacrifices. What a weird way to gather as a religious community. I mean, there's different types of sacrifices in the Old Testament period. One's called the whole portion, where somebody would grab a whole animal, give it to the priest. They would prepare the entire animal and give that offering to God because they believed that God was above us. And so if you wanted to give God a meal, to be hospitable to God, you had to put it on an altar. And so the fumes would go up to God, and God would take a real big whiff of your sacrifice. Okay? There's a type of offering called a portion offering where you would bring some animals to God, and a portion of it would go to God on his altar, and then a portion would come back to you, and you'd actually feast with God together, which makes you think, okay, which fork do I start with when I'm actually communing with God at the dinner table? Which one? I don't want to mess up here. But there's a way for us to commune with God. One is to give God a gift for all that you're thankful for. Another one is to actually spend time with God. But let's be honest. As modern Bible readers, don't you plunge through the material of Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all these and go, why am I reading this and why is this relevant to my life? Talking about two pigeons and this non-split hoofed animals off limits and blah, 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 and how you cut them open and all this stuff. All the queasy ones in the room are questioning why they came to church this morning. You think stuff like, this seems barbaric. This seems out of date. But something that we didn't know is that this is actually a step forward in the midst of religious environments in this community. Other neighboring communities, as we studied their worship practices, they had no idea what they needed to offer God to please God. They just knew that they were counting on rain. They were counting on God's power in battle. They were counting on God to give them more children. And so they were offering stuff from their fields. And when that wasn't enough because they didn't get rain, so they lost a battle, they would take something that had breath in it, like something of livestock, and they would offer more and offer more. If that didn't seem to please the gods, they began to look around further. What's the greatest gift that I can give them? There's actually evidence that neighboring communities in the Old Testament world were offering firstborn children as a gift to God as a sacrifice, because what could be greater than your offspring? But there was an anxiety. We are not sure if we have peace with God. It's different in the Old Testament community because when Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy tell you that if this is your sin, if this is what's going on, you bring these animals and you know you're good with God. So you can go into the temple, you can give it to the priest, and when the smoke goes up, you're not leaving wondering, have I done enough to please this God? What this vision in the Old Testament is we're taking a leap forward. You know that you have peace with God. So as we read about the temple of sacrifice, know that this is grace upon grace upon grace for anxious people in a dangerous and anxious world. But like anything else, the temple sacrificial system got corrupt like anything else that you give human beings a chance to control. There's some evidence that maybe they were charging too much and they were making it very difficult for common people to offer the right sacrifice of worship. And so there's this critique that begins to build at the end of the Old Testament period that perhaps we're going to move beyond the sacrificial system of animals. You go to a place like Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, where we see this discrepancy. God says, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." It seems like these folks are saying, okay, we need to bring the animals, we need to spend our time, then we have peace with God. It's like folks who wander into church every now and again are like, well, I'll just eat the wafer and I'll drink the juice and let's see what happens. But what's the prophet saying here is, no. Seek God through these elements. Seek God through these patterns. You've lost your way. Or go to a place like Micah chapter 6. People love Micah 6, 8. It's some people's favorite verses. Somebody in this room is bound to have it tattooed on them somewhere. But notice the verses that critique the Israelite community and why verse 8 is even a thing. It says, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Thousands of animals, if not done in the right spirit, accomplish nothing." And this is the critique at the end of the Old Testament. That's why the writer Hebrews in Hebrews 9 and 10 begins to critique the sacrificial system. He says, he or she, we don't know who wrote Hebrews yet, but I heard she's really wonderful. Anyways, this is what the writer says. They say that the blood of bulls and goats was unable to cleanse the consciousness of the believer. Something lingered in the soul. That's why it was important for a greater gift, a greater offering, a human one, to lay down their life for the sake of many. That's why that argument reaches its crescendo in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and following, where it says, "For with the joy that was set before Jesus, he endured the cross and he scorned its shame." Something more powerful is able for us to know that we have peace with God, to understand that Jesus willingly took the pile of sins of the faithful upon him to the cross. He paid for our death and our penalty, and he allowed us to go free and to find our place of freedom and hope and love and justice. Jesus allows our consciousness to be cleansed once and for all as God's people. And there's somebody on this side of the room, you have an alarm at noon. I know what you're trying to say to me. I know I've got 9 minutes. I know it, okay? I know it. That's why we're going to go long today. That's why I got my seat. So even though the early Christians aren't going to the temple any longer, what's interesting is that they actually retain the image of sacrifice, because the metaphor is important. Offering something with gratitude, bringing a gift to express gratitude is important. And so we have Romans chapter 12, verse 1, that long letter from our brother Paul. It goes through this long, windy twists and turns of an argumentation, and it all reaches all the way to its apex here in Romans 12:1. This is a verse that many of you have on a coffee mug at home. Maybe you've got this tattooed on your body too. It says, therefore, and listen to the language here, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. A couple things to note here. A living sacrifice would have been a confusing image. Any animal offered on that altar was dead and had been dealt with so that it could be offered. But Paul's saying here, we don't offer animals any longer. We offer ourselves. And we don't just offer it once, but a habitual, routine, whole, complete offering of ourselves to God day after day after day. This vision of Christianity goes beyond that one time when my head was bowed, my eyes were closed with everyone else, and I poked my head in the air, and I felt momentary relief. Paul's saying the way of the Christian life is ascending onto the altar moment by moment and offering ourselves completely and wholly to God and being content with that and finding the wisdom of that every single moment. But in order to do that, I think we need to clean up our idea of what a sacrifice is. I think in the English language, our view of sacrifice is different than in the biblical content. I think sometimes we think of sacrifice as an unfortunate thing. I was talking to my friend Andy, who's a pastor's kid, and he told me this unfortunate story. He and this family of four, his dad, who was a pastor in the Cleveland, Tennessee area, they decided they want to go to Disney one summer, so they pooled all their money together, and mom and dad came to the kids and said, we can go to Disney this summer or you can go to college. Please pick between the two. Disney, right? And so they piled in the van. They started to careen their way down to Orlando, Florida, and they get a call 100 miles into their journey. And the call on the other line said, Sister so-and-so just passed away, Pastor, and we need you to turn around and come do the funeral. And his dad tried to implore, isn't there another pastor? I know that we're Pentecostal and everybody thinks that we're weird, but isn't there a Presbyterian in the room that could do a memorial service so that my family and I, we've been looking forward to this trip for months, that we could go to Disney World? And they said, Pastor, you need to do this. This is what you're called to do. And my friend Andy said, it's stories like that, again and again, that reminded me of the sacrifice of the life of ministry. Let me just say, that's an unfortunate story, and that's not biblical sacrifice. Biblical sacrifice is always something that's honorable. Remember when Jesus went to the cross, Hebrews chapter 12 once again? Jesus didn't go to the cross and say, well, I guess this is the only option. I wish it wasn't the case. No, Hebrews 12 says, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross and scorned its shame. Sure, he had a moment where he's like, he's Father, is there another way? But not my will, yours be done. Sacrifice is best looked at this way. You ever watch a baseball game and the lead runner of a team gets on first base and the guy next at bat decides to lay a bunt down to the third base line in order to advance that runner from first base to second base, and he gets thrown out at first base because now the runner at second base is in scoring position with only one out, and they have a high probability of scoring a run that inning? Notice what happens when that guy goes back, the guy who bunted and got out at first. When he goes back to the dugout, the guys don't say, man, we're really sorry that you had to do that at your at-bat. We know that you like to swing the bat, and a bunt is kind of a lame thing to do. Next time you could swing away. No, what do? Have you ever seen this? They throw him through the gauntlet of high fives and chest bumps and every other barbaric thing that male athletes do. Because they said, because you gave up your at-bat, it's exalted the team. Sacrifice is shaped by a willingness to know that even though I go lowly this time, it is an honorable, efficient, and praiseworthy thing to do. It's not unfortunate, but it is praiseworthy. Which brings us back to our question that we're mulling this morning. Why do I continue to do this? There's some of us, we've been putting hard work into a relationship, hard work into our occupations, hard work into parenting our kids in the way of Jesus. And it doesn't seem like anything's growing from it. And we're growing weary. And we're wondering where the answer is going to come from. What I want to suggest to you that this is the shape of the Christian life and that God is faithful. Brother Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, I love the way that he uses these words because he's probably grappling with the church that's going through the same question asking that we are in our hearts and minds. Paul says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Everything done in Jesus' name will not be wasted or forgotten about, but it's all going to add up. There's a great, big, long Greek word in the Greek New Testament. We find it in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10. And this is mathematical term that tries to get to the bottom of this reality. And the Greek word is anakaphalaosisthai. That's your next tattoo. That's it. What it means is this, that God's going to make it all add up. Those moments of solitude when you don't feel like anything's working in your prayers. Those moments of service when nobody's looking to pat you on the back or to tell you you've done a good job and encourage you. It's all adding up like change to make $1. God remembers it, and he's going to make it add up. We must not grow weary and lose heart. This reminds me of a story of Sesto Rodriguez, musician. He was at the center of a documentary called Searching for Sugar Man. And Sisto was a musician who had a really meager career in the United States. Recorded 2 records, but it really didn't take off and go anywhere. He went to South Africa for a mini tour and to Australia for a mini tour. But when he came back, he was discouraged. He felt like nothing was happening with his music. So he decided to hang it up just to make it a side hustle and to go back to his hometown of Detroit and to become a construction worker. So for 40 years, he's slinging a hammer, putting cabinets together, measuring twice, cutting once. But in the meantime, his music has caught on like wildfire in South Africa, and he has no idea. Some of his tunes were used to fuel this anti-apartheid protest that toppled over an oppressive regime in South Africa. And so one day, as his daughter was, the early days of the internet, she just Googled his name into the internet, and she finds that there's a fan page in South Africa this whole time. He's building cabinets, and people are singing his songs, and musicians are covering them in South Africa. And so they all meet together, and they haul him over to South Africa. They book a venue with 3,000 seats, and his kids are going, this is going to go terribly. There's going to be like 7 people here. Imagine the joy they felt when every seat was taken and every person in the room sang along with their dad and his songs. This all happened underneath and behind and in secret. And at the proper time, it came into view. It came into light. In the same way, the prayers you're praying for your kids, for your spouse, for the cause that you've been donating your whole life to, friends, let's not give up. Let's not lose heart. Because just like Zechariah, who knows, one day in the midst of mundane activities, you're going to hear from God. And he's going to say, do not be afraid.